Still not married, Eleanor?" Marcus Whitfield's laugh sliced through the gentle hum of Belmont's tea room like a blade through silk. The elegant London establishment was filled with the usual buzz of high society on this warm spring afternoon in 1817. Soft chatter floated through the air as women whispered behind fans, and gentlemen engaged in quiet conversation. Eleanor Ashworth sat alone at a small table, her delicate fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, her attention more on the book in her hands than the people around her. But then Marcus Whitfield entered the room, the door swinging open with a creak that caught Eleanor's ear. He strode in, tall and confident, his sharp features framed by the soft light streaming through the windows. Behind him, his new fiancée, Miss Georgiana Hartley, followed, her laughter high-pitched and fluttering like a bird. They were a picture of youthful charm and wealth, while Eleanor, in her modest dress, sat alone, a stark contrast to their shining faces. Marcus's eyes landed on Eleanor, and for a moment, a brief flash of recognition crossed his face. He seemed to pause, but only for an instant before the familiar smirk curled on his lips. As he made his way over to her table, his voice rang out, falsely sweet. "Still not married, Eleanor? How tragic." He leaned back slightly, his body language that of a man who believed himself untouchable. His new fiancée, Georgiana, looked down at Eleanor with a disdainful glance before joining in, her voice dripping with mockery. "I suppose, at your age, one must accept spinsterhood with grace." Eleanor's grip on her teacup tightened, but her face remained serene. Her lips curled into a smile, the kind of smile one wears when faced with challenge. Slowly, she set her teacup down on its saucer, the soft clink of porcelain barely breaking the tension that hung between them. "How kind of you to inquire, Mr. Whitfield," she replied, her voice calm, almost too calm, as though she were discussing the weather. "But I am no longer unmarried." Marcus's laugh echoed in the room, a sound full of mockery. "Oh, really? And who, may I ask, would have misfortune of marrying you?" His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement, unaware of the weight his words carried. Georgiana giggled, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor's modest attire. "Is that last season's fabric?" she asked with exaggerated sweetness. "How charming." Eleanor didn't flinch, her expression unchanging. "I had other engagements to attend to," she said smoothly, her eyes briefly flicking down her lap, where a delicate pocket watch was tucked into the folds of her dress. The gleam of it caught Marcus's eye, but he didn't understand the significance. "You must be so proud of your humble life," Georgiana added with a laugh that barely hid the disdain in her voice. "Living so quietly in the country, I imagine. Much better than facing the cruel judgment of London society, wouldn't you agree?" Eleanor glanced down at her watch once more, her fingers brushing the delicate chain that held it. The time was nearing 4 o'clock, the hour she'd been waiting for. "I expect my husband to arrive shortly," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his mocking expression faltering for just a second. "Your husband?" He let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Really, Eleanor, must you resort to such ridiculous lies? What, is he a clerk? Some lowly bureaucrat?" Eleanor remained composed, her gaze steady. "He's attending Parliament today," she replied softly. The words hung in the air, but Marcus was too absorbed in his cruelty to catch their meaning. "Parliament." Marcus scoffed, clearly amused. "What, as a clerk or something? Is that what you mean? Hardly a worthy match for someone like you." Eleanor's lips pressed together, but her smile didn't waver. "He's quite busy, but I assure you, he is not a clerk," she said calmly, the mystery of her words growing as she glanced at the other patrons in the tea room. Several of them were whispering now, casting furtive glances toward her table. Some seemed to recognize her, their whispers too soft to catch, but still charged with curiosity. Marcus, oblivious to their gazes, leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. "Well, then I must say I'm glad to see you manage to find a suitable partner." He cast a brief glance at his fiancée, who was still eyeing Eleanor with that same look of distaste. "I suppose we can all look forward to hearing how, well, you've been doing, though I suspect your life remains far from exciting." Eleanor simply raised her eyebrow, unfazed. "I'm sure you'll hear of it soon enough." Marcus's words grew sharper. "Well, let's see your proof, Eleanor. Show us who this mysterious husband of yours is, and then we can end the charade." His voice was challenging, but Eleanor didn't falter. With a quiet, almost dismissive gesture, she extended her hand across the table. The large sapphire ring on her finger gleamed brightly, its surrounding diamonds catching the light. The silence in the tea room deepened as Marcus's eyes flicked from the ring to Eleanor's face. He stared at it for a moment, blinking, as if the sight before him didn't quite make sense. That can't be real," he said, his voice faltering for the first time. "Surely, that's just paste jewelry, isn't it?" Eleanor's smile remained composed, though there was a glint in her eye. "It belonged to my husband's mother," she said simply. "The Ravenscroft sapphire, it's called." At this, Marcus's confidence wavered. For a brief moment, doubt flickered across his face, but he quickly recovered, unwilling to admit he might be wrong. "The Ravenscroft sapphire," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue, but the smirk never left his lips. "How convenient," he muttered under his breath, his eyes not quite meeting hers. Georgiana, sensing his uncertainty, snorted with laughter. "Oh, really, Eleanor," she said, "even if you did marry, which we all doubt, you certainly marry beneath you. Some country squire, no doubt, taking pity on you." Eleanor didn't respond to the insult, but her gaze flickered over to Marcus, now determinedly leaning back in his chair. "I assure you," she said quietly, "I'm married quite well." Georgiana scoffed. "Then why are you sitting here alone? If your husband is so important—" She raised an eyebrow, as if Eleanor's very existence was somehow a great mystery that must be solved. Eleanor's gaze never faltered as she answered, her voice still steady. "I told you," she said coolly. "He's at Parliament. He had business to attend to." Marcus let out a derisive laugh. "Parliament, huh? Right. And I'm the Prince Regent." At this, the murmurs in the room grew louder. Eleanor noticed the whispers gathering strength. More patrons were eyeing her now, their gazes curious, some even recognizing her. But Marcus, consumed with his cruel taunt, was too absorbed to notice. "Do you not see the truth?" Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. "He is the Duke of Summerton, actually." There was a pause, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Marcus's expression froze. His laughter stopped dead in its tracks. The words had landed, and as he opened his mouth to respond, he found himself utterly speechless. The trap had been set. As Marcus laughed at Eleanor's absurd claim that she was married to the Duke of Summerton, his words seemed to bounce off her like raindrops off a stone, unable to leave any mark. But as his cruel chuckle echoed in her ears, the room blurred, and her mind drifted back to a time when things were different, when she had once hoped, with all the innocence of a young woman in love, that Marcus Whitfield might be the man to rescue her from her lonely, modest life. The memory took her back to the spring of 1816, to the days when she was still Eleanor Ashworth, the unassuming daughter of a deceased gentleman, living with her widowed mother, Margaret, in a small, neat home on the outskirts of London. They had modest means. Her dowry was far from impressive, perhaps a mere £1,000, but the Ashworths were respectable, their name clean, and their hearts full of hope for Eleanor's future. At 26, Eleanor had begun to worry that her chances of a match were dwindling. Yet Marcus Whitfield, the charming, handsome heir to a barony, seemed to see something in her that others hadn't. For 4 months, Marcus had courted her with attention that felt genuine. He brought her flowers, and they enjoyed leisurely drives through Hyde Park in his cockle, a gesture that seemed so romantic and real to Eleanor. He was kind to her mother, attended church with them on Sundays, and made her feel like she was worth something more than just a woman with a small dowry. Eleanor's heart blossomed with hope, convinced that Marcus had fallen in love with her. Not her fortune, not her social standing, but her as a person. Her mother, too, began to hope for the best. It seemed clear that a proposal was imminent, and for the first time in years, Eleanor's life was filled with excitement, anticipation, and the promise of a future where love and security could intertwine. But everything changed at an assembly at the Hartley estate in May of 1816, a night that would haunt her for years. The evening had started like any other. Eleanor had arrived with Marcus by her side, her heart racing with the anticipation that this might be the night he would finally propose. They were greeted by the usual social chatter, the music playing softly in the background and the scent of jasmine and roses in the air. But it was there in the glittering crowd that Eleanor first saw Georgiana Hartley, just returned from Bath after a long stay. Georgiana was everything Eleanor wasn't. Beautiful, wealthy, and with a dowry that made even the most eligible bachelors of London stand at attention. At just 19 years old, she was a vision in a gown of cream silk, her blonde curls perfectly coiffed, her laugh a tinkling melody that seemed to capture every man's attention. Marcus had known Georgiana as a child, but as soon as he laid eyes on her, Eleanor saw the transformation in him. A shift in the air, a change in his posture, as he had just spotted a rare and precious jewel among a sea of common stones. Within the hour, Marcus was dancing with Georgiana, his attention fully captured by her wealth and beauty, while Eleanor stood aside, feeling the sting of rejection without a word being spoken. Within the next week, Marcus had turned his attentions entirely to Georgiana, showering her with compliments, flowers, and lavish gifts. He abandoned Eleanor without so much as a farewell, leaving her humiliated and confused, trapped in a cruel game of social maneuvering that she hadn't even known she was playing. The hurt, though, didn't come solely from Marcus's abrupt shift in affection. It came from the rumors that started to circulate through London. Eleanor Ashworth was painted as desperate, clingy, and unworthy. Poor Marcus Whitfield had to escape her advances, whispered one society lady. She was far too eager, too unsuitable for someone of his stature, murmured another. She threw herself at him, and he had no choice but to reject her. These whispers poisoned her reputation, turning what had once been a hopeful future into a life of quiet humiliation. Invitations to social events dried up, and gentlemen who had once paid her attention now avoided her. It was as though Marcus had weaponized his rejection, turning their brief courtship into a weapon that cut her down in the eyes of society. The rumors spread like wildfire, faster than Eleanor could comprehend. She was no longer the young woman hoping for a proposal. She was a pitted girl, the poor dear who had been left behind, too proud to admit her humiliation. Her self-worth, once intertwined with the hope of marriage, crumbled under the weight of the lies being told. In truth, Eleanor never understood why Marcus had chosen Georgiana over her. She couldn't make sense of the fact that he had left someone who had been, by all appearances, devoted to him, for a woman he barely knew, simply because of her wealth. Did Marcus truly believe that love could be purchased? Did he believe that beauty and a dowry could make a person worth more than the kindness, intelligence, and heart that Eleanor knew she possessed? In the months following the assembly, Eleanor's life felt like a quiet spiral into obscurity. She had to leave London in June 1816, when her mother's health took a sharp decline. Margaret, frail from the stress and the societal rejection, found the city's cruelty unbearable. They retreated to a small cottage in the countryside, far from the whispers and the pitying looks. Eleanor's world became smaller and quieter. She spent long, lonely hours caring for her mother, whose health never fully recovered. The countryside offered peace, but it also brought an overwhelming sense of resignation. Eleanor had no prospects left, no suitor, and no future. The world that had once seemed full of possibility now felt cold and empty, and she resigned herself to the reality that she would live out her days as a caretaker, a forgotten woman, unloved and unimportant. There was a comfort in the simplicity of the countryside, a solace in the knowledge that the harsh judgment of society could no longer reach her. But it also became a cage. Eleanor filled her days with books and long walks through the garden, but even the beauty of the country could not ease the ache in her heart. She had been rejected, not just by Marcus, but by society as a whole. She had believed in the idea of love, in the notion that a man would see her as someone worthy, but that belief had shattered. Marcus had proven to her that worth was not measured by love or kindness, but by wealth and status. Eleanor spent the summer and autumn of 1816 in this quiet isolation, her world reduced to the soft rustling of leaves and the turning of pages in her books. She told herself that she had accepted her fate, that she had no other choice but to let go of the past. But then, in December of 1816, everything changed. It was a day like any other, a cool winter afternoon when Eleanor, still grieving but somehow trying to regain some sense of normalcy, agreed to attend a country assembly with her cousin Harriet. Harriet had been gently urging Eleanor to rejoin the world, to stop hiding from the people who would pity her, but Eleanor had been hesitant. She had no desire to face the harsh eyes of society again. But Harriet persisted, and after much coaxing, Eleanor agreed to attend, though with no expectations. It was at that assembly, in the humble drawing room of a small village house, that Eleanor's life would take a turn she never could have imagined. The room was filled with the usual mix of local families, many of whom had known Eleanor as a child. But there was a palpable difference in the air as the door opened and a tall, commanding figure stepped into the room. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The Duke of Summerton had arrived. Frederick Ravenscroft, the Duke, was well known, one of the wealthiest men in England, and with that wealth came an unmatched influence in both social and political circles. Every woman in the room looked at him with eager eyes, their hearts racing at the sight of such a powerful man. But it wasn't his wealth or his title that caught Eleanor's attention. It was the way he looked at her. He crossed the room with purpose, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Eleanor, sitting quietly in a corner with a book in hand. She was reading as usual, trying to disappear into her own world. But when he approached her, there was no pretense, no idle chit-chat. "You seem the only sensible person in this room," he said, his voice low but full of a quiet strength. Eleanor looked up, startled. "Your Grace," she stammered, her heart suddenly racing. "May I sit?" he asked. And sit he did. For the next 2 hours, they talked. They discussed books, philosophy, and poetry with a depth that startled Eleanor. For the first time in months, she found someone who didn't look at her with pity or judgment. Frederick Ravenscroft, the Duke of Summerton, saw her, and in that moment, something deep inside Eleanor began to change. But she had no idea, in that quiet, innocent conversation, that her life was about to be transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The night of the country assembly had changed everything for Eleanor Ashworth. When Frederick Ravenscroft, the Duke of Summerton, had approached her that evening, he had done so with a genuine curiosity and a rare kindness that she hadn't experienced in months, perhaps even years. The two had shared a conversation that flowed with ease, touching on books, poetry, and philosophical musings, topics that had always fascinated Eleanor. She had felt seen and valued for her mind and spirit, not for her social standing or her modest dowry. When Frederick had left the assembly, he had done so with a promise to call on her, and he kept that promise. The next day, just as the dawn light streamed to the windows of her small cottage, a knock came at the door. Eleanor had barely had time to adjust to the idea of seeing the Duke again before he stood before her, taller and even more imposing than she remembered, holding a bundle of books they had discussed the night before. His visit left Eleanor flustered, but there was an undeniable sense of warmth in his presence, a stark contrast to the coldness that had surrounded her for the past year. Over the next several days, Frederick came by often, each time with a new book in hand, a thoughtful gift, or a gentle invitation to walk the grounds of her cottage. It was not a grand courtship in the way society would expect from a man of his rank, but there was something refreshingly real about it. Frederick didn't overwhelm her with lavish gestures or empty promises. Instead, he treated her with an unwavering respect that she hadn't known was possible. Eleanor's mother, Margaret, who had been skeptical about any future for Eleanor after her disgrace in London, began to notice the difference in her daughter. Eleanor was no longer the quiet, withdrawn woman she had been. There was light in her eyes again, something that had been missing for far too long. And when Frederick asked if he might take Eleanor for a drive in his magnificent barouche, a carriage so grand it seemed to embody the very wealth of the Duke, Eleanor had hesitated only for a moment before agreeing. The carriage ride was unlike anything she had ever experienced. As they crossed the beautiful countryside, the world felt at peace, and for the first time since her world had come crashing down a year ago, Eleanor allowed herself to truly smile without fear or restraint. Frederick had opened her heart in ways that Marcus Whitfield never had. He didn't see her as a prize to be won, nor did he ever speak of dowries or titles in a way that made her feel less than she was. They were two people, two equals, simply enjoying one another's company. It was a feeling Eleanor had nearly forgotten existed, and as they traveled to the rolling hills, she began to wonder if, perhaps, she could dare to hope once more. Frederick didn't stop at just a drive. He began to share pieces of his own life with her, including his family's sprawling estate, Summerton Hall, an ancient manor that seemed to stretch on forever across the 50,000 acres of land. When he invited Eleanor to visit, she had been overwhelmed by the grandeur of the place. Yet, as they toured the vast grounds, it was clear that Frederick wasn't a man enamored with wealth for the sake of wealth. He was a man who had grown weary of the trappings of his title, someone who had seen the superficial nature of London's high society and rejected it. "I've met thousands of women seeking my title," Frederick had told her one afternoon as they walked the gardens of Summerton Hall. "But you're the first who saw me for who I truly am." Eleanor had been taken aback by the sincerity in his words, her heart stirring with emotion. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she mattered, not because of her status or what she could bring to the table, but because of the person she was. There was no pressure, no rush. Frederick simply let her be herself. He respected her mind, her intelligence, and most importantly, her heart. It was a kindness that she had never before known, and the more she learned about Frederick, the more she realized that he was a man of substance. It wasn't just his wealth or his title that attracted her. It was the way he made her feel alive, valued, and most importantly, loved. As Christmas approached, Frederick's devotion to Eleanor deepened. He took her to conservatory at Summerton Hall one evening, surrounded by winter roses that bloomed within the glass walls. The scene was enchanting, a fairy tale come to life, and it was there in the soft glow of the candlelight that Frederick knelt before Eleanor, holding a ring in his hand. A ring that had once belonged to his mother, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, a piece of history, a legacy. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice rich with emotion, "I am not asking you to be a duchess. I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, my love. Will you marry me?" Tears had welled in Eleanor's eyes as she gazed at him, the reality of the moment settling over her like a warm blanket. She had been afraid to hope again, afraid that the cruel betrayal of Marcus Whitfield would forever taint her understanding of love. But with Frederick, there was no fear, only the certainty that this was real, that he loved her, truly loved her for who she was. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Frederick, I will marry you." The engagement was set, and the wedding followed quickly. By March 1817, Eleanor Ashworth became Eleanor Ravenscroft, the Duchess of Summerton. It was a small ceremony held at the chapel within Summerton Hall, attended by only a handful of close friends and family. Eleanor's mother, who had once feared her daughter would never find happiness again, was there, her health noticeably improved, and Cousin Harriet, who had been a constant support throughout the dark days, stood beside her as a bridesmaid. The world seemed to shift for Eleanor as she exchanged vows with Frederick. There was no pomp, no grand celebration, only the quiet promise of a life filled with love and companionship. The ceremony was simple, but in its simplicity, it was everything Eleanor had ever dreamed of. They spent their honeymoon at Summerton Hall, far from the prying eyes of London society, in peaceful bliss. For the first time in Eleanor's life, she felt truly at home, not because of the wealth of the title, but because of the love that surrounded her. She had married for love, and that love had transformed her life in ways she had never thought possible. It was during their honeymoon that Eleanor truly began to understand the depths of Frederick's affection for her. He had never married for political advantage, never courted a woman for her title or dowry. He had chosen her because of the woman she was, the woman who had endured the humiliation of Marcus's betrayal and emerged stronger for it, the woman who, despite the cruel world, still believed in love. 6 weeks of married life passed in this perfect bliss, with Frederick at her side, making her laugh and filling her heart with joy. But then, the responsibilities of his title called him away. He had to attend Parliament in London, and though Eleanor had never been one for the glittering society of the capital, she was determined to face it now on her own terms. She had been humiliated in London, cast aside like an unworthy thing by Marcus Whitfield. But now, she would return as a married woman, the wife of the Duke of Summerton. She had nothing to fear. She had been remade. They traveled to their townhouse in London just the day before, and Eleanor's first outing in the city, though nerve-wracking, was empowering. She went alone to Belmont's tea room that afternoon, determined to reclaim her place in society, not as a discarded woman she had once been, but as a respected and beloved Duchess of Summerton. She never expected, however, that Marcus Whitfield would cross her path again, and in the most cruel and unexpected way. As Eleanor sat quietly in the tea room, hoping for a peaceful moment to herself, the man who had once broken her heart, the man who had destroyed her reputation, walked in with Georgiana Hartley on his arm. The scene was almost too surreal for Eleanor to process at first. Marcus didn't recognize her, of course, and when he opened his mouth to mock her once more, she found herself facing the very man who had helped shape her into the woman she had become, the woman now so much more than he had ever understood. The table had been set for the reckoning to come. The moment Marcus Whitfield opened his mouth, Eleanor knew exactly what was coming. She had expected it. In fact, she had anticipated the cruel mockery and the sharp, condescending remarks, though nothing could have prepared her for the sting of hearing them again, especially after everything she had been through. As he laughed, his eyes gleaming with a certain cruel satisfaction, he turned toward her and repeated his disbelief in the most mocking tone possible. "The Duke of Summerton married you?" His voice echoed through the room, his words like daggers aimed directly at her. Georgiana Hartley, standing beside him, seemed almost to revel in the spectacle. Her laughter was high-pitched, but it was not the sound of genuine amusement. It was the laughter of someone who had no idea the consequences of their words, and who believed they were untouchable beyond reproach. Eleanor remained seated, her posture as poised as ever, but inside, something was shifting. She had thought, for a fleeting moment, that Marcus's behavior could be ignored, that it would not matter, but the reality of it stung more than she had expected. She knew what Marcus was doing. He was not just mocking her for her past, for her perceived failure in love and society. He was trying to make her doubt herself, trying to make her feel like she had never truly moved on from the shame he had so callously heaped upon her. But she would not give him the satisfaction. She would not allow him to take away the peace she had worked so hard to find. "Believe what you wish, Mr. Whitfield," Eleanor replied coolly, her tone laced with a calmness that only seemed to inflame his arrogance further. Her words hung in the air, seemingly challenging him to keep going, daring him to dig deeper into the hole he had already begun to create. "You know, Eleanor, I never expected this from you," Marcus continued, his words almost dripping with false concern. "I thought you had more sense than to invent such ridiculous tales. The Duke of Summerton? Really?" He almost spat the words, as though he could not comprehend how anyone could think she, of all people, could land such a prestigious match. "If he married you, it must have been out of pity," he sneered, looking down at her with disdain, completely oblivious of the fact that every word he uttered was sinking him deeper into the abyss of social disgrace. His fiancée, Georgiana, joined in, her voice high with mockery. "Oh, poor thing! Trying so hard to look respectable," she said, her eyes scanning Eleanor's modest day dress as if she were inspecting a piece of trash. "Look at that fabric. Last season's, I think. How quaint." The insult was meant to sting, to remind Eleanor of the social ladder Marcus believed she had failed to climb. But Eleanor was no fool, and she did not flinch. Instead, she simply raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a faint smile, one that said far more than words ever could. She knew they were trying to provoke her, to get her to respond in some way that would validate their cruel narrative. But she would not give them the pleasure. She had faced much worse than this. After all, "I assure you, I am perfectly content with my choices," she said calmly. "But I did think you might have moved on by now, Mr. Whitfield. I certainly have." Her words were not meant to be cruel, but they were firm, and they struck Marcus in a way he did not expect. He blinked, his smile faltering for a brief moment. But then he recovered, leaning forward with a renewed sense of condescension. "I'm sorry," he said, with a feigned air of sympathy, "but you simply don't seem like the type to be happy in your current circumstances." The implication was clear, that no one could truly be happy without wealth, status, and the approval of society. It was a damning belief, one that reflected his ignorance and arrogance. But Eleanor was no longer the woman he had once known. She had seen through the thin veil of his charm and understood him for what he truly was, someone who valued wealth and appearance over character and kindness. "You are quite mistaken, Mr. Whitfield," she replied, her voice steady. "My happiness does not depend on society's approval or your judgment." Marcus's face twisted with frustration, his mouth opening to retort. But before he could, Eleanor extended her hand, the gleaming ring on her finger catching the light. The large sapphire, surrounded by diamonds, seemed to mock him in that moment. "Perhaps you would like to see this," Eleanor said softly. The room fell silent as every eye turned toward her hand, and Marcus's eyes narrowed. His expression shifted, as though he was trying to convince himself that what he was seeing was a mere trick of the light. "That can't be real," he muttered, his voice wavering for the first time. But Eleanor did not back down. She let the silence stretch for a beat, watching as his disbelief grew. "It is real," she said, her voice low but clear. "It belonged to my husband's mother, the late Duchess of Summerton. It's called the Ravenscroft sapphire." The words hit Marcus like a slap to the face. He recoiled slightly, blinking as though the weight of her statement had not yet fully registered. The other patrons in the room, who had been quietly watching the exchange, began to whisper among themselves. Some seemed to recognize the significance of the ring, their eyes widening in sudden realization. Lady Pemberton, a well-known member of the ton, caught Eleanor's eye, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. She knew exactly what was happening, and her lips pressed together in a tight smile. But Marcus, consumed by his own arrogance and sense of superiority, could not accept what he was hearing. "Ravenscroft sapphire," he repeated, his tone almost mocking. "How convenient for you to claim such a thing." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. "But even if it is real, it means nothing. I still don't see how someone like you could land such a man." Georgiana, sensing his discomfort, pushed forward with her own attack. "Even if you did marry him, and I doubt it, you must have married beneath you," she sneered. "Some country squire who took pity on you, perhaps?" Eleanor's smile deepened, but her eyes grew colder. "You are mistaken," she said, her voice soft but laced with a quiet strength. "I'm married quite well. My husband is a man of honor, intelligence, and kindness, more than you could ever hope to understand." Georgiana snorted, clearly unimpressed. "Then why are you sitting here alone, Where is your husband? If he's so important—" Eleanor did not flinch, but her gaze grew sharper, more intense. "I told you," she said, her voice unwavering. "He is at Parliament. He had business to attend to." Marcus let out a sharp laugh, the sound bitter and hollow. "Parliament," he sneered. "Right, and I'm the Prince Regent." Eleanor glanced at the clock on the wall, the hands nearing the hour. She checked her pocket watch again, a subtle gesture that only she noticed, but it gave her a sense of calm. She knew what was coming, and she was prepared. The tension in the room was thick, palpable, as Marcus continued to taunt her. He was digging himself deeper, but he could not see it. "You're still the same desperate girl I rejected," Marcus said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Still clinging to your lies and fantasies." Eleanor stood then, her movements graceful but deliberate. "I am not lying, Mr. Whitfield," she said softly but firmly, "and I am not desperate. But you, sir, are about to be very embarrassed." She glanced toward the door as the footman entered. "Excuse me, Your Grace," the man said, his voice clear and loud. His Grace, the Duke of Summerton. The door opened, and all eyes in the room turned toward the figure standing in the doorway. Frederick Ravenscroft, the Duke of Summerton, entered with the air of a man accustomed to command, his dark eyes scanning the room. Every woman in the room seemed to stop breathing at the sight of him, and even Marcus, who had been so convinced of his superiority, froze in his seat, his smug expression faltering. Frederick's gaze landed on Eleanor, and the hardness in his expression melted away, replaced with a warmth and tenderness that made the entire room hold its breath. He walked toward her with purpose, ignoring the curious eyes of everyone around him. As he reached her side, he bowed slightly and kissed her hand with perfect elegance. "My darling, forgive my tardiness," he said softly, his voice full of affection. The room went utterly silent as Marcus, his face ashen, stood frozen in his seat, struggling to comprehend what was happening. Georgiana's mouth hung open in shock. Frederick's eyes flicked to Marcus, and then, With a faint but unmistakable smile, he turned his attention back to Eleanor. The truth was about to be revealed, and Marcus was about to be humiliated in the most public of ways. The stage had been set, and all that was left was for Marcus to realize the truth. Eleanor Ashworth was no longer the desperate, discarded woman he had once known. She was the Duchess of Summerton, and Frederick Ravenscroft was her husband. The moment Frederick Ravenscroft stepped into the tea room, everything changed. The air, thick with tension, seemed to freeze, and all eyes turned toward the Duke. Marcus Whitfield, still standing half-risen from his chair, looked at Frederick as though he had just encountered a specter. The tall, commanding figure of the Duke was immediately striking. Frederick's posture was regal, his dark hair perfectly styled, his tailored coat cut with such precision it only accentuated his strong frame. His piercing blue eyes scanned the room with practiced indifference, but when they fell on Eleanor, the transformation was immediate. The cold, imperious gaze softened, replaced by a look that was unmistakable in its warmth and tenderness. He crossed the room toward her without hesitation, his presence undeniable, his every step calculated and confident. The hum of whispers that filled the room died instantly as Frederick approached Eleanor's table. He ignored everyone else entirely, a subtle but telling sign that his attention was focused solely on her. As he reached her, he stopped beside her chair, bending slightly as he took her hand in his. His lips brushed her fingers in a soft kiss, one that sent a ripple of astonishment through the room. "My darling, forgive my tardiness," he said, his voice low and smooth, laced with genuine affection. Eleanor, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and pride, smiled up at him, a quiet, knowing smile that only he could understand. "You're here now. That's all that matters," she replied, her voice warm, a contrast to the cool air that still hung around Marcus and Georgiana. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. The other patrons in the tea room, still stunned by the arrival of the Duke, exchanged quick glances, trying to process what was unfolding. Marcus, meanwhile, was struggling to comprehend what was happening. His eyes darted between Frederick and Eleanor, his face shifting through a range of expressions, from disbelief to confusion, and then to something darker, something like dawning horror. He had been so certain, so smug in his certainty that Eleanor was nothing more than a poor, unimportant woman, a victim of her own desperate imagination. Now, the truth was staring him in the face, and he didn't know how to respond. "Your Grace, what an unexpected honor," Marcus said, his voice shaky, unsure of himself for the first time in years. He attempted to stand, but the attempt was awkward, half-hearted. He could not bring himself to face Frederick directly. "Are you acquainted with Miss Ashworth?" he asked, his voice faltering as if seeking some confirmation that would explain this outrageous turn of events. Frederick, who had been standing by Eleanor's side, turned his eyes toward Marcus, the coolness of his gaze sending a shiver down Marcus's spine. "I'm not sure we've been properly introduced," Frederick said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who never had to prove his worth to anyone. "But I know her well enough," he continued, his gaze never leaving Marcus. "Allow me to properly introduce my wife." He turned to Eleanor, his expression softening even further. "Eleanor Ravenscroft, Duchess of Summerton," he announced, each word hanging in the air like a heavy gong. The room fell into a complete silence. Marcus's face, once so filled with disdain and arrogance, now showed only confusion and then horror. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out at first. The realization of what had just been revealed struck him like a thunderclap, and the full weight of his previous words slammed into him with a crushing force. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had so cruelly discarded, was now the Duchess of Summerton, married to the wealthiest, most powerful duke in England. For a moment, Marcus looked as though he might faint, his expression twisted in disbelief, then in anger, and then in humiliation, as he slowly began to process the situation. "You married him?" Marcus stammered, his voice thick with disbelief. "The Duke of Summerton? But you were nothing." His words trailed off as he struggled to find a way to justify his past cruelty, to explain the lies he had spread to protect his own fragile pride. Frederick stepped forward then, his voice cutting through Marcus's stammering. 3 months ago," he said, his voice calm but ice-cold, "Eleanor and I married. I chose her, not for her wealth, not for her title, but for the woman she is, the woman you discarded so easily. Marcus's face flushed with a deep, ugly red. But you were nothing, he said again, his voice thick with the bitterness of his own failure. You had no dowry, no prospects. No one would have ever thought you worthy of a man like him. He was desperately searching for any excuse, any justification for his actions. But Frederick's gaze never wavered. She had everything that mattered, Marcus, Frederick replied, his tone deliberate, the weight of each word heavy with finality. Intelligence, grace, genuine warmth, integrity. Qualities that, unfortunately, men like you cannot appreciate. You had a treasure, and you threw it away for gold coins. The words landed like a slap. Every eye in the room, which had been silently watching the exchange, now shifted uncomfortably. The whispers, once full of skepticism about Eleanor's claim, now turned into murmurs of awe. Lady Pemberton, who had recognized Eleanor from the start, was quietly nodding in approval. She exchanged knowing glances with the other ladies, each of them silently acknowledging the truth that had just been revealed. Marcus Whitfield, the man who had once been considered a desirable match, was now nothing more than a social pariah, his reputation in tatters. Georgiana, still standing beside Marcus, had been watching the exchange with growing horror. Her eyes widened as she began to grasp the enormity of the situation. She had been complicit in the cruelty toward Eleanor, adding her own brand of disdain to the mockery. And now she was witnessing the very unraveling of the life she had hoped to secure by attaching herself to Marcus. Marcus, she whispered, her voice trembling. We should go. But Marcus, too stunned to move, stood frozen in place. He could not bring himself to leave, not yet, not before he had somehow explained himself. I don't understand, he muttered, his voice still shaken. You were a nobody. How could you land him? It was a question born of pure disbelief. The question of a man who had never learned to value the true qualities of a woman. The Duke of Summerton, Marcus repeated, as though trying to convince himself of the impossibility of the situation. Frederick's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he addressed Marcus directly. You courted Eleanor Ashworth, he said, his voice cold, and then you abandoned her without a second thought for someone with a wealthier dowry. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You spread rumors to justify your dishonorable behavior, and you humiliated her in front of all of London. But today, Marcus, you encounter her and you mock her again, unaware that she has risen far above you. The room was silent as Frederick's words sank in, each one landing like a sharp blow. Marcus's face contorted, his pride bruised beyond repair. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words were lost in the weight of his humiliation. Frederick, without hesitation, continued. I trust this will serve as a reminder, Marcus, he said, his voice ice cold, that true worth has nothing to do with dowries, and that cruelty, eventually, finds its reckoning. Every word struck home, each one a reminder of the cruelty Marcus had inflicted on Eleanor. Now, Frederick said, his tone shifting slightly, I believe you owe my wife an apology. The words were simple, but the weight behind them was crushing. Marcus stood frozen, his face drained of color, as the reality of his situation became painfully clear. He had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. He had no choice but to apologize, to admit to the world that he had been wrong. But even as he struggled to find the words, the damage had already been done. The room was alive with whispers, as patrons who had once respected Marcus now turned their backs on him. His reputation, carefully crafted over the years, was shattered in an instant. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He was finished. He had no place in society anymore. He had insulted the Duchess of Summerton, the wife of one of the most powerful men in England, and he had done so in the most public way possible. There would be no recovery for him now. And as he stood there, humiliated and broken, Eleanor turned toward him, her expression calm and unyielding. I think you owe me more than an apology, Marcus, she said, her voice steady, but her words cutting through the silence like a sword. You owe me the truth. The truth was out now, and there was nothing Marcus could do to undo the harm he had caused. The room had witnessed his fall from grace, and now he would be forced to live with the consequences of his actions for the rest of his life. As for Eleanor, she had triumphed, not through vengeance, but through the quiet strength she had always possessed. She had found the love and respect she deserved, and the man who had once mocked her, the man who had believed her to be unworthy, now had to face the truth of his own weakness. The Duke of Summerton, Frederick Ravenscroft, had made her his wife, and that was a victory no insult could ever take away. The room was suffused with a thick, uncomfortable silence after Frederick's declaration. Marcus, his face drained of color, still like a man in shock, unable to process the full extent of his downfall. The Duke of Summerton, Eleanor's husband, had laid bare every cruel detail of Marcus's behavior, exposing him for the dishonorable man he was. There was no denying the truth now. The whispers of the other patrons in the tea room became louder, each word a subtle acknowledgment of Marcus's disgrace. The once admired gentleman, the man who had once held sway in society with his charm and wit, was now a pariah, his reputation crumbling in front of everyone. It was as if the very air in the room had turned cold, the weight of Frederick's words hanging like a storm cloud overhead. Marcus's face twisted with a mix of humiliation and anger. He had been caught, exposed, and there was no way out. He had once believed himself to be untouchable, his wealth and connections shielding him from the consequences of his actions. But now he realized just how wrong he had been. His attempt to salvage his dignity only made things worse. As he stood there, his mouth opening and closing in a desperate bid to form some kind of coherent defense, Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Your apology, Mr. Whitfield," she said, her tone cold but polite. "I believe you owe me one." Her words were not cruel, but they carried the weight of someone who had been wronged deeply, someone who had been humiliated in front of the very society that had once valued her. She was not asking for vengeance. She was demanding respect. Marcus's face flushed even deeper, the shame now evident in every feature. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The reality of his situation settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He had no way to undo the damage he had caused, no way to take back the lies he had spread, or the cruel mockery he had heaped upon Eleanor. His gaze flickered to Georgiana, who stood beside him, her eyes wide with shock, her hand fluttering nervously at her side. She had been complicit in this cruelty, had joined in mocking Eleanor without a second thought, and now she was witnessing the full consequences of her actions. The sight of Eleanor, so calm and composed in the face of this public humiliation, only added to the weight of Marcus's regret. Georgiana's face twisted with discomfort, but she didn't speak. She had no words of defense, no excuse for the part she had played. She had seen the look in Eleanor's eyes when she had first encountered her, and now she saw the power that Eleanor held, power that came not from wealth or status, but from the dignity and self-respect that Marcus had once tried to strip from her. The patrons of the tea room, once silent observers, now began to murmur among themselves. Lady Pemberton, who had recognized Eleanor from the beginning, was the first to move. She approached Eleanor with a look of admiration in her eyes, her voice warm and welcoming. "Your Grace," Lady Pemberton said, a smile curling at the corners of her lips. "We didn't realize you were in town. Why didn't you send word? We would have been honored to have you visit." Her words were a subtle but unmistakable rebuke to Marcus and Georgiana. The shift in the room was palpable. Society, it seemed, had already made its judgment, and Marcus was no longer the man he had once been. The women in the room began to gather around Eleanor, eager to speak with the Duchess of Summerton, their earlier interest in Marcus now forgotten. One by one, the ladies turned their backs on Marcus and Georgiana, leaving them isolated and alone. It was the most severe insult that could be given in polite society. The cut direct, the once proud man, who had been the center of attention moments before, now stood in stunned silence, his reputation in tatters. The whispers grew louder, and the tide of social favor turned swiftly against him. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. Marcus had been caught in his own lies, and now he was nothing. Georgiana, who had once believed that Marcus's wealth and status would elevate her, began to feel the full weight of her mistake. She looked around the room, her face pale, realizing that the social standing she had once enjoyed was now slipping through her fingers. She had mocked Eleanor, had joined in the cruelty without thinking of the consequences, and now she was facing the fallout. She could feel the eyes of the other women on her, and the disapproving glances were almost too much to bear. A deep, unspoken understanding passed between the other ladies in the room. Georgiana's engagement to Marcus was, for all intents and purposes, over. The damage had been done, and no amount of pleading or excuse-making could undo the insult she had been a part of. It was only a matter of time before her father, Mr. Hartley, would be informed of the full extent of Marcus's behavior. Georgiana's position was now precarious, and it was clear to everyone in the room that the fallout from this encounter would be far-reaching. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his humiliation. His eyes flickered to Frederick, the Duke of Summerton, and then to Eleanor, who stood beside him, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around him. Frederick's gaze was cold, but there was something almost triumphant in the way he stood beside his wife. He had protected her, defended her honor, and now he was watching the man who had once insulted her crumble under the weight of his own actions. "Marcus," Frederick said, his voice low but firm, "you've made your apology. Now you should leave." The words were not a suggestion. They were an order. And Marcus, for the first time in his life, realized that there was no way to challenge the Duke's authority. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue. The world had shifted beneath him, and there was no room for him in it anymore. His social standing was gone, his influence shattered, and the mockery he had made of Eleanor had come back to haunt him in the worst way. Slowly, he nodded, his head hanging low, and turned toward the door. His exit was met with no words, no offers of sympathy, only the cold silence of those who had once held him in high regard. As he left the tea room, his fate sealed, the whispers continued. "Did you hear what happened at Belmont's?" One woman murmured. "Marcus Whitfield mocked the Duchess of Summerton. Can you imagine? And the Duke was there, defending her, right in front of everyone," another added. "Marcus has lost everything." The conversation was already spreading throughout London, and by evening, the entire city would know of Marcus's disgrace. Meanwhile, Eleanor stood at the center of the room, her grace and composure never faltering. She had been humiliated, cast aside, and disrespected, but now she was not only respected again, she was revered. Her strength had been proven in the face of cruelty, and her reward was not wealth or status, but something far more valuable, the love and respect of those who mattered. "Shall we go, my dear?" Frederick asked, his voice soft but filled with quiet affection. He reached out to her, offering his arm. With a smile, Eleanor accepted it, and together they walked toward the door. The social scene, once focused on Marcus and Georgiana, now shifted to the couple that had come to symbolize the triumph of love, honor, and integrity. As they left the tea room, the whispers faded behind them, replaced by the knowledge that Eleanor had come out on top, not through vengeance, but through grace. She had risen far above the man who had once rejected her, and now she would live her life, not as a victim, but as a woman who had found happiness, love, and respect in the arms of a man who truly valued her. Marcus, on the other hand, would be left to pick up the pieces of his shattered reputation, knowing that no matter what he did, he would never again be the man he once was. His attempt to destroy Eleanor had only led to his own destruction, and no amount of apologies or excuses would ever undo the harm he had caused. For Eleanor, though, the journey was just beginning, and the future held nothing but promise. The morning after the debacle at Belmont's tea room, the air in London was buzzing with gossip. Whispers swirled from drawing room to drawing room, from one gentleman's club to the next, and by noon, Marcus Whitfield's once stellar reputation had been all but destroyed. Eleanor Ravenscroft, Duchess of Summerton, was the talk of the town. Her quiet dignity in the face of Marcus's cruel mockery had only solidified her position in society. She had not reacted in anger, but with quiet grace, exposing him for what he truly was, a man who, despite his wealth and status, lacked the honor and integrity that truly defined a person's worth. As the story spread, many in London began to look at Eleanor with new eyes. She was no longer the poor, desperate girl discarded by a man seeking a wealthier match. She was a woman who had risen from the ashes of shame to become one of the most respected figures in the ton. Invitations to parties, dinners, and gatherings poured in, and Eleanor found herself at the center of it all. But it was not the attention or the adoration that pleased her most. It was the way she had regained her sense of self. She had never sought revenge. She had only wanted to live her life with dignity. Now, as she sat beside Frederick in their elegant townhouse, she felt the full weight of her transformation. No longer hiding from the whispers and judgment of society, Eleanor was ready to face it all on her terms. Frederick, ever supportive, had seen the change in her as well. He had watched her move through the ordeal with an inner strength he had always admired. But now, there was a new depth to her, an inner peace that radiated from her every movement. He could see the joy in her eyes, the contentment that came from knowing that her true worth had been recognized, not just by society, but by herself. As they sat together in the carriage, making their way to yet another dinner party, Frederick took her hand in his fingers brushing hers gently. "I am proud of you, Eleanor," he said softly, his voice full of admiration. Eleanor smiled at him, her heart swelling with love. "I didn't do it for anyone but myself," she replied, her voice quiet but resolute. "But it does feel good to know that what I am is enough." Frederick squeezed her hand gently. "You've always been enough," he said, his voice filled with affection. "And I will always stand by you, no matter what." It was a promise she knew he would keep. The life they had begun together was everything she had once dreamed of and more. But it was not just their private happiness that made Eleanor feel complete. It was the way she had earned her place in the world, not as a woman defined by her past or by the rejection of Marcus Whitfield, but as the woman she was today. A woman who had found love, respect, and a sense of purpose. And now, as they attended one dinner after another, her presence was met with genuine warmth, not pity or mockery. She had reclaimed her place in society, not because of her title or her wealth, but because of the person she had become. Her strength, her resilience, and her kindness had earned her respect, and that was something that no one could take away from her. As the weeks passed, Marcus's situation grew steadily worse. No longer the charming, sought-after bachelor, he was now a man with few allies. His arrogance and cruelty had alienated him from many of the people he had once called friends. The invitations he had once received with ease now became scarce. He found himself shunned by those who had once admired him. His reputation, one of the shining examples of social grace, now lay in ruins. It was not just his friends who turned away. His business connections began to falter as well. The stories of his cruelty toward Eleanor, of the way he had discarded her for a wealthier match, spread like wildfire through London's elite circles. The whispers were not just about his mistreatment of a woman who had once been in love with him. They were about his complete lack of character. He had shown himself to be a man who was willing to sacrifice his integrity for wealth, a man who would abandon a woman who had loved him, simply because she could not provide him with a fortune he desired. And, in the end, that was the thing that truly destroyed him. Marcus had always believed that money, status, and reputation were the most important things in life. But when those things were stripped away, he was left with nothing. His soul, so long focused on acquiring wealth and power, had been hollowed out, and now, as his life crumbled around him, he had no one left to turn to. Even Georgiana, who had been so eager to marry him, now distanced herself from him. Her father, Mr. Hartley, had received word of the scandal surrounding Marcus, and it wasn't long before he made his decision. He broke off the engagement with no hesitation, his voice filled with scorn. "I will not have my daughter married to a man who behaves dishonorably," he said, his words cutting through the air like a sharp knife. "The entire ton knows what you did, and that you had the audacity to mock the Duchess of Summerton. Well, that's simply unforgivable." Georgiana, though initially resistant to break, soon found herself relieved. She had seen Marcus's true nature during the tea-room incident, and the cruelty he had shown to Eleanor had opened her eyes. She had come to realize that Marcus was not the man she had once believed him to be. The man who had discarded Eleanor, who had mocked her, was not someone she could respect or love. And so, without a moment's hesitation, she broke off the engagement. She had been chasing the idea of wealth and status, but now she realized she had lost both in her association with Marcus. For a time, she stayed in London, but eventually, she returned to the country. She married a kind, modest gentleman, someone who appreciated her for who she was and not for her dowry. It was a quiet, uneventful marriage, but Georgiana was far happier than she had ever been with Marcus. She never spoke to Eleanor again, but she sent her a letter, an apology for her part in the cruelty that had been visited upon her. Eleanor received it graciously, but it was clear that the chapter was closed for her. She had moved on, and there was nothing left to dwell on from the past. The story of Marcus Whitfield, the man who had abandoned her for gold, was now a distant memory. Eleanor's life with Frederick was everything she had ever wanted. They attended social events together, and everywhere they went, they were met with respect and admiration. The love they shared was real and deep, and it was clear to everyone who saw them together that their bond was unbreakable. They were not just a power couple. They were a couple who truly cared for each other, who had found in one another a sense of peace and joy that no amount of wealth or title could buy. Frederick's love for Eleanor had been constant, steady, and true, and it was that love, more than anything else, that had allowed her to rise above the hurt and humiliation of her past. As they sat together in their drawing room, the warmth of the fire flickering in the hearth, Eleanor rested her head on Frederick's shoulder, feeling a deep sense of contentment. She had found everything she had ever hoped for: love, respect, and a future filled with promise. And as the months passed, the whispers of the tea room incident faded into the past, replaced by the growing legend of Eleanor Ravenscroft, the Duchess of Summerton, the woman who had triumphed over cruelty and humiliation to claim her place among the most respected women in London. For Marcus Whitfield, however, the aftermath of his actions would follow him for the rest of his life. His name, once synonymous with charm and elegance, was now associated with shame and dishonor. And though he would try to rebuild, to regain what he had lost, he would never again be the man he once was. His actions had destroyed him, and he would never be able to escape the consequences of his cruelty. But for Eleanor, the future was bright. She had found a love that was pure, a love that had not been tainted by greed or ambition, and that love would carry her through the rest of her life. It had been a long road to get here, but now, as she sat beside Frederick, she knew that every step had been worth it. She had faced her past, had confronted the pain and the shame, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and far more deserving of the happiness she had now found. And with Frederick by her side, she knew that the future held nothing but promise. 2 weeks had passed since the scandal at Belmont's tea room, and Marcus Whitfield's fall from grace had become the talk of every corner of London. His name, once synonymous with charm and sophistication, was now spoken with contempt and pity. Invitations to the clubs, the drawing rooms, and the soirees he had once frequented vanished, replaced by silence. The whispers were everywhere. No one wanted to associate with the man who had mocked the Duchess of Summerton, the woman who had once been his heart's desire and whom he had so callously discarded. Society had already made its judgment, and Marcus knew that there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. He was no longer the darling of the ton. He was a pariah, an outcast who had lost his position and his pride. Eleanor, on the other hand, had flourished in the wake of that humiliating encounter. The day after the incident at Belmont's, the entire city seemed to have recognized her for what she was, a woman of strength, dignity, and quiet resilience. She had never sought revenge, had never looked for the moment of triumph that society had so eagerly granted her, but that moment had come nonetheless. Her life with Frederick was everything she had dreamed of and more. They were a true partnership, not just a political match, but a union built on love, respect, and admiration. Frederick had always been there for her, supporting her in ways that no one else ever had, and now, together, they were untouchable. The morning after the scandal, Frederick had taken her in his arms and whispered, "You were magnificent yesterday. You've taught me what it means to truly rise above." It was a simple truth. Eleanor had shown the world her strength without needing to stoop to petty revenge or vindictiveness. She had taken the high road, had stood tall in the face of mockery, and had emerged victorious, not because of wealth or title, but because of the woman she had become. The thought of Marcus Whitfield, of the man who had once tried to make her feel small and insignificant, no longer filled her with anger. Instead, it sparked something else, something like pity. She realized that his rejection of her had been about his own insecurity, his inability to see the true value in a woman who had so much more to offer than gold. And though she had suffered for a time, it had only made her stronger. She had discovered who she truly was and what she was capable of. The night after the tea room incident, however, a letter arrived that would change everything. It was from Marcus, and it was his last attempt to salvage what little remained of his reputation. Frederick had already seen the letter, but he waited for Eleanor's response. He knew this moment would be important, as it marked the last chapter of the painful story that had begun with Marcus's betrayal a year ago. Eleanor, having read the letter in silence, looked up at Frederick with a calm expression, one that revealed the depth of her understanding. "I suppose it is time," she said softly. "I should finally face him once and for all." Frederick nodded, his eyes filled with concern, but he said nothing. He would support whatever decision she made. "I think I should see him," Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "But I won't do it alone. You must come with me." A meeting was arranged for that afternoon at Summerton House, in one of the drawing rooms that Frederick had so carefully cultivated into a space of comfort and safety. Eleanor knew the moment she agreed to meet with Marcus that this would be the final confrontation, the final reckoning. It would be the moment that would close the chapter on her painful past and allow her to fully step into her future. When Marcus arrived, he was not the confident, arrogant man who had once courted her. Instead, he was a shell of his former self, haggard and desperate. He had lost weight, his face gaunt, his eyes dull with the realization of everything he had lost. The once proud man seemed small and insignificant in the grand, opulent surroundings of Summerton House. His clothing, which had once been impeccable, now seemed ill-fitting and out of place. The transformation was striking, and Eleanor could hardly believe this was the same man who had once captured her heart, or so she had thought. When Marcus entered the room, he bowed deeply, addressing both Eleanor and Frederick with a strained, shaky voice. "Your Grace," he said, his words faltering. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I must offer it all the same." He looked at Frederick, then back at Eleanor, his gaze filled with guilt. "I was wrong. I treated you terribly, Eleanor. I humiliated you. I abandoned you for someone with a wealthier dowry, and I spread lies to justify it. I cannot undo the pain I caused you, but I want you to know that I regret it more than anything." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and for a moment, Eleanor allowed herself to reflect on the man he had once been, the man she had believed loved her. It was clear now that he had been motivated by something far more shallow than love, but she also understood that he was broken, that his own emptiness had led him down a path that was as much about his own weakness as it was about her. "I accept your apology," Eleanor said quietly, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Not for your sake, but for mine. I need to let go of the anger, the bitterness. Holding on to that would only keep me bound to you, to the past. I will not let it define me any longer." Marcus, still standing before them, seemed to shrink under her words. He had expected her to be angry, to lash out at him, to demand a public apology. Instead, she had shown him the grace he never thought she was capable of. He was ashamed, truly ashamed, for the way he had treated her. He had thought, in his arrogance, that he could control her, that he could discard her when she no longer suited his purposes. But he had been wrong, and now he saw the consequences of his actions. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Marcus muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "But I hope that one day you'll understand how deeply I regret what I did." He turned toward Frederick, his posture stiff with a kind of shame that could not be hidden. "I would never have dared to mock her if I had known who she truly was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But that's no excuse for the way I treated her. I can't undo what I've done, but I can only hope that, in time, my apology will be enough to ease some of the pain I caused." Frederick, ever the silent protector, remained calm but firm. "You've apologized," he said, his voice low but clear. "That's all you can do. Now go and try to rebuild what's left of your life." The words were not harsh, but they were definitive. Marcus stood for a long moment, his head bowed, and then he left, the weight of his failure heavy on his shoulders. Eleanor watched him go, feeling a sense of quiet closure. She had no animosity toward him, no desire for vengeance. She had learned what she needed from the experience, how to rise above, how to embrace her own worth, and how to let go of the past. As the door closed behind Marcus, Eleanor turned toward Frederick, who was standing by her side. His eyes softened as he looked at her, his voice filled with quiet affection. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hand gently brushing hers. Eleanor nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "I am," she said simply. "More than all right." The future stretched out before them, wide and full of promise. Together, they had weathered the storm of Marcus's cruelty and had come out stronger for it. The life they had now, built on love and respect, was everything she had ever dreamed of. As they walked out into the sunlight, hand in hand, Eleanor felt no regret, no sorrow, only the quiet, certain knowledge that she had found her place in the world, and that it was more than enough. She had been through the darkest of times, but now, as the Duke of Summerton's wife, she had everything she needed: love, respect, and a future full of hope.